Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, I'm going to spend some time doing a little bit of teaching on the subject of Israel. There's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, it is always helpful to kind of go back to the pages of Genesis, and in particular Genesis 12, and we'll also look at Deuteronomy 28 and some other passages to talk about the establishment of a nation of Israel. Some of the promises, we're going to look at 3 promises given to Abraham and, in a sense, to the Jewish nation, and 3 predictions. And then I want to begin to move through history pretty quickly. We'll jump over very significant segments of our history in Western culture to a time, really, first we'll look at Europe and eventually even the establishment or the attempt to establish a nation of Israel, and then conclude for the other reason I wanted to talk about that, and that is the Trump administration over the last couple of years has actually had some actions towards Israel, which some people see as controversial, others see as a fulfillment, if nothing else, of the promises given to Israel. So we're going to look at all of that. And as we go through here, I would encourage you maybe to take some notes or even go to some of the books and resources we're going to recommend. The first, and if you're taking some notes, would be to look at 3 promises in Genesis chapter 12. They are the 3 I wills, if you will. And so the first one is a promise of a nation, in which God says, I will make you a great nation. Now, when this promise was given to Abram, becoming, of course, Abraham, as Hal Lindsey points out in one of his books, The Everlasting Hatred, this was a big problem for Abraham and his wife because they were childless and advanced in years. But it really was a promise of a son through whom the nation would be created. And it also was a promise for the land, which we'll get to a little bit later, because obviously you can't have a nation if you don't have the land. So the first obvious promise is the promise that I will make you a great nation, the first of the 3 I wills. The second is a promise of special blessings, maybe even special personal blessings. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Now, that promise unfolds in a number of different ways. First of all, God protected and blessed him with special protection, great wealth, health, even in his old age, which made him successful in all that he did. Number 2, the promise implicit in that as well, and explicit in the second part of that promise, is that I'll make your name great. And if you think about that, the name of Abraham is, even to this day, considered quite great. He is recognized as the spiritual leader of 3 of the largest religions, 2 of the largest religions, and 3 of the major religions in the world. That would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And, of course, God promised as well to make him a blessing. So you have not only the blessing to him, the fact that his name would be great, but then he would be blessing as well to others that would come after him. And if you think about that, the blessing that has come from Judaism and Christianity, and even though this is sometimes controversial, there have been blessings that have come even from Islam as well. You can see the impact that particular promise was. So first was a promise of a nation. I will make you a great nation. Second, a promise of special blessing. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And then the third, a promise of divine protection. And that is, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And this third one is really kind of interesting as well, because there have been many that have looked at this and said, if we are supportive of the nation of Israel, then God will bring a blessing. And there are people that like to point to countries that have blessed Israel, and then what has happened when those countries have turned against Israel. There are countries that have always been ready to destroy Israel, and see what has happened to them as well. Now, at this point, let me mention the fact that while there are Christians that believe these promises not only are given to Abraham and extended all the way through the Old Testament, there's some, both Christians and non-Christians, that say, well, they don't apply today. You have some Christians that have said, well, those blessings and those promises given to Abraham and to the Jews were then taken over by the church. And we have talked about this on this program before. We've had people like Mark Bailey, president of Dallas Theological Seminary, Darrell Bach, a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, and others talk about what's called replacement theology. So I'm not going to get into that right now, but I recognize and at least want to acknowledge that some Christians don't believe that they apply today. You have others that are maybe not even Christians that say, well, even if the promises were for the Jewish people there, these people in Israel today, they're not all that Jewish. We've got a lot of secular Jews, and so do those really apply? Or maybe they just simply say, I don't believe the Bible, and so you have that kind of mindset. So first of all, you have those three promises, and if indeed you believe that they were given to Abraham and extend on to the Jewish race, and that this also brings them to the promises of the land, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, then those apply as well. And that brings us to our three predictions. The first prediction, which you find in Deuteronomy 28, the Lord will bring a nation against you from far away. And many people believe that although you have the northern kingdom taken into exile earlier, the fulfillment of that particular prediction was when you had Babylon come and the destruction, really, of Israel by Nebuchadnezzar, taking those individuals captive into Babylon. The second part of Deuteronomy 28 says, then the Lord will scatter you among the nations. And a lot of people believe that that was fulfilled when you had the Roman general Titus and the Roman 10th Legion come into Israel, destroy Jerusalem, and in a sense you have the scattering of the Jewish race. No longer do they have access to the homeland, and so you have what is called the diaspora. And then finally you have in Deuteronomy 30, he will bring you to the land that belonged to your fathers, and you will take possession of it. And many people believe that that is a prediction that was actually fulfilled with Israel being established in 1948. And we're going to talk when we come back from the break about the implications of those predictions, but also the history that eventually led to the establishment of the nation of Israel. And then we're going to spend some time talking about some of the wars that Israel had to fight in order to maintain its sovereignty, and then eventually wind down with some of the various actions by this administration towards Israel, and try to put all of this in context. So again, if you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more, I would certainly highly recommend the book by Joel Rosenberg called Epicenter. I've just a little bit quoted from a book by Hal Lindsey called The Everlasting Hatred, The Roots of Jihad, which really is more about Islam, but has some great history about Israel, and we'll talk about some of that after the break. But this is an attempt to try to put some of the things that have been happening in the modern nation of Israel, but to tie it all the way back to what happened and some of the promises and predictions given to Abraham and the ancient country of Israel. But we need to take a break. So when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how did it eventually become a really remarkable thing that the Jews returned back to the land. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Lately, politicians on both the left and the right have been criticizing capitalism. Senator Elizabeth Warren calls for accountable capitalism. Senator Marco Rubio proposes what could be called common good capitalism. And Senator Bernie Sanders proposes democratic socialism as an alternative to unfettered capitalism. By the way, they aren't the only ones using the term. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz argues in his book, The Bit of Everything, for a new social contract. He says we need to get rid of the kind of selfish, unfettered capitalism we've had for the last 40 years. Jonah Goldberg, in a recent column, asked the same question I've been asking. What on earth are these people talking about? Decades ago, during the progressive era, presidents did all they could to restrain capitalism. Teddy Roosevelt broke up the trust, and Franklin D. Roosevelt created dozens of government restraints during the New Deal. Jonah Goldberg asked another good question. If you think there are no restraints on the market or on economic activity, why on earth do we have the Department of Labor, HHS, HUD, FDA, EPA, OSHA, and the IRS? Yes, our economy sometimes benefits certain people and organizations more than others. This isn't because of unfettered capitalism. It's due to the fetters government puts on certain sectors of our society to the benefit of others. It's called crony capitalism. Laws and bureaucratic regulations benefit select businesses and industries in agriculture, manufacturing, banking, and a variety of other fields. So if you think the government needs to spend more or regulate more or tax more, then make your case for doing so. But let's stop arguing against the straw man of unfettered capitalism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again doing a teaching on Israel, and just a minute ago we looked at three very important promises in Genesis 12, and then three predictions, which you can find in Deuteronomy 28 and 30. And so we left with this idea of the fact that there was the dispersion of the Jews in what is called the diaspora. And even in the midst of that, there is a remarkable, I think, fulfillment of prophecy in the sense that the Jewish nation continued on. Because you look around the world today, and maybe you can find Egyptians, but can you find any of some of these others? You know, where are the Phoenicians? Where are the Hittites? Where are some of the Babylonians? Because after a while, that all sort of intermarries, and as a result, you can't really find a pure, if you will, racial line, but you find that very much in the Jewish world. And one of the slides that I oftentimes show to people that is a good illustration of that fulfillment is a slide that I have of Napoleon. And it turns out that Napoleon, when he was in his campaign in what at that time got to be called Palestine, which of course is our modern day Israel, he at one time asked his generals if they had any proof that the Bible is the Word of God. Napoleon asked a number of those kinds of questions throughout his life, and I won't get into all the details, but his generals replied that through the centuries of dispersion, the Jews remained a distinct people waiting for his promised return to the land of their fathers. And so even before we get to some of the attempt to try to return Jewish people to the land, you have the remarkable integrity of the Jewish race, which is, I think, very striking. But this now, if we can, fast forwards to after the Protestant Reformation. And what began to happen first in England was a desire to read the Bible differently. It was, I think, pretty typical in the Catholic Church and in other various groups and Christians along the way to look at some of the prophecies and things like that as maybe just apocalyptic and maybe metaphors, but they weren't necessarily taken literally. But you certainly had, after the Reformation, at least one particular group, and that would be the Puritans, who began to say, you know, we need to just read all of Scripture in a literal way. We need to just use a kind of normal interpretation of Scripture. And so as a result, they began to take seriously some of the Scriptures about the Jews in the land, especially in the book of Revelation. And so that began kind of an interesting discussion about that. And I thought it was kind of interesting because I read this recently, that when you even look at the Puritans, they all not only were starting to read the Bible literally, but they began to take seriously some of the statements even in the Old Testament. And I read this again in this book I mentioned just a minute ago. By the mid-17th century in England, you know, names like Mary and John or Paul, Peter, Luke, whatever, were dismissed for names like Enoch, Amos, Obadiah, Esther, Rebecca. Some of the English Puritans even had children named Zerubbabel, Habakkuk, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were individuals that would study the Scriptures almost all day when they had an opportunity. Obviously, they had to work, but when they would have free time, they would study it, and they were really beginning to be quite interested in how some of these prophecies would actually play out. Which brings me to another slide that I show so often when I speak to people about some of this, and that is a picture I put up of Isaac Newton. Now, when you think of Sir Isaac Newton, you think of him as really the scientist. I mean, after all, he made remarkable changes in science. I mean, everything from his theory about gravitation, Newtonian physics, those of us that were subjected to having to study calculus. He's the one that invented calculus in order he could do some of the kind of research he could do. But most people don't know that Sir Isaac Newton, in addition to being a scientist, was a real student of prophecy, and he was one of those individuals that was reading and studying the Bible in a literal way. One of his comments was that after the time of the end, a body of men will be raised up who turn their attention to the prophecies and insist on their literal interpretation in the midst of much clamor and opposition. And that's exactly what happened, because then in England, among the Christians, there began to be a great fascination with the Holy Land, and they began to read the Bible kind of with a new interpretation. And at the same time, they were well aware of the fact that in the British government, Jews had been banned from England in the 17th century. And so the idea began to dawn on them that rather than trying to bring them back to England, which was certainly one of the things that a number of people wanted to do, maybe it would be better if we could begin to have them go back to their land, and that is, of course, the Holy Land as well. Now, in the midst of that, you have some individuals, and I've got some great information here as well, which you can read more detail if you'd like, about Oliver Cromwell, who even exhorted his parliament to actually provide funds for the restoration of the Jewish nation. He reasoned, quote, "Truly you are called by God as Judah was to rule with him and for him. You are the edge of the promises and the prophecies." Well, Oliver Cromwell didn't get very far. The Parliament did not agree. Maybe it was because it was not God's timing. Maybe it was because Cromwell himself was going to face very significant issues. But nevertheless, that was an attempt, at least at the time, to even provide an opportunity for the Jews to return back to the land. And during that very instrumental time, you had, of course, Jews that would gather together wherever they were during Passover. And one of the statements that they would make always is, "Next year in Jerusalem." So now we fast forward a little bit further to Lord Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. He served as England's foreign minister and signed this famous Balfour Declaration. This happened after the end of World War I. When, of course, Germany was defeated, it also meant the defeat of the Turks. And so as a result, all of that which had been covered and really overseen and ruled by the Turks was now under at least some kind of rule by the English. And so you had, of course, England's foreign minister, who was Lord Balfour, and signed this Balfour Declaration, and they began to draw lines in the sand. And one of the other ministers at that time, a man by the name of Winston Churchill, who, by the way, went on to ultimately be the prime minister, began to draw lines as well. And so there was an attempt to actually set aside a land mass. And again, if this was on television, you could see that this would include today, present-day Israel, and a lot of what we would consider to be Syria, even part of Iran, and mostly Jordan. And this was an attempt to really provide what was called a land for the people and a people for the land, one of the lines of Lord Balfour. What happened very quickly, interestingly enough, is that as that was set aside, very quickly, Emir Abdullah said, wait a minute, I need some land. So what they did was they actually took the section that is east, if you will, of the Jordan River and described that as Transjordan, and that began to be the beginnings of what today is the country of Jordan. But it still left to the west of the Jordan River the idea of something that could actually be settled by some of the Jewish people. And they did in a small amount. But then we will, after we come back from the break, spend some time talking about what happened after World War II, because then you really do have the possibility of a Jewish state being established through the United Nations partition plan. And then shortly after that, you have a series of wars, because the Arab states did not want Jews there. They tried to push them into the sea, failed. Then you have the 6-Day War. You have the Yom Kippur War, and you have all sorts of treaties that have existed since that time. So we'll get back into some of those details in just a minute. But if nothing else, we can see that over time there was a desire, in part because of the willingness to read the Bible from a literal point of view, and also believing that the prophecies would be fulfilled if Jews went back to the land, of establishing a Jewish homeland. So when we come back from the break, we'll talk about how that was done, what actually took place at that time, some of those wars, and then eventually talk about some of the other kinds of actions that have been taken by this administration towards Israel and the current state that Israel finds itself in the 21st century. So if you'd like to know a little bit more, as I've mentioned, there are some great books that are available, and you can read more about that. Joel Rosenberg's book, Epicenter, is one of those. Hal Lindsey's book, An Everlasting Hatred, The Roots of Jihad, which is really more about Islam, but does have some opening chapters and closing chapters that get into some of these details. And if you'd like to read more about that, I would encourage you to get copies of those books as well. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover in Israel, and we'll do that right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about Israel and giving you a little bit of the history of Israel, the establishment of the nation of Israel, and even kind of the current situation we find today. Let me just mention that as we were talking about the Balfour Declaration, even as that was changed so that about 75% of the land that would have been given to the Jews in Israel went to what came to be known as Transjordan, there were a number of other actions by the British that have been roundly criticized, even at the time, even were criticized, interesting enough, by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. But because of this sort of policy of appeasement, you had Israel never really getting established until there was the UN partition in 1947. Now, recognize even in 1945, there were some Jews coming to the land. I think I saw some numbers about maybe 15,000 or something like that. But when you had 6 million Jews that were killed by Hitler's Holocaust, there was a desire on the part of people around the world to say, maybe it is time to really allow the Jews to immigrate there. And so some did, as well as Arabs. And so the UN partition plan in 1947 actually allocated some land for a Jewish state. It was sort of like a, if you will, kind of a hopscotch kind of look, in which some of the land which today we would be considering the Golan Heights, some of it by Tel Aviv along the coast, and then some of them in the Negev Desert was theirs. Then other portions, whether it be the Gaza Strip or the area near the Sinai or what today sometimes is called the West Bank and other places, would be Arab, and then Jerusalem would be administered. Well, this is a good example of where the Jewish people there accepted that, the Arabs did not, and so they finally established a nation of Israel in 1948, and that led almost instantaneously to one of at least 5 major wars that we can talk about. There was one in 1948 and 1949, one in 1956, but in a minute I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the 2 major ones, 1967, the Six-Day War, in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. But nevertheless, in each particular case, sometimes people refer to these as sort of modern-day miracles, because Israel found themselves outgunned almost instantaneously every time they were attacked by various nations, and we'll get into some of that in just a minute. And so originally, they were perceived as kind of the David fighting against Goliath. But over time, the world opinion began to focus on, well, what about those Arabs in that eastern part of Israel, or what's called the West Bank, which would be west of the Jordan River, but of course east of Tel Aviv. And so they began to be seen as the David, and all of a sudden Israel was referred to sort of as the Goliath. And you don't really understand some of the movements today to criticize Israel in the United Nations, or the movement of the BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Disinvestment, Sanctions against Israel, without understanding that. But I'm going to jump over that to the most significant of the wars, and that was the Six-Day War, because prior to 1967, there were major tensions between Israel and its neighbors, but in particular, this was developing between Israel and Egypt. At that time, the president was President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he had already closed the straits in one case, which basically cuts the nation off. And so once he again announced that the straits would be closed, on June 5th, Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields, and really within a matter of, I think some people said 30 minutes, pretty much had devastated the Egyptian Air Force, and thus had taken all of the land which today we oftentimes refer to as the Sinai Peninsula, I should say, right up to the Suez Canal. And so this was certainly a place where they had greater protection against Egypt. Of course, they also have the land that we today call the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and even part of what today we would call Lebanon. And so then you fast forward to 1973, where there was a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria and others against Israel during its holiest day, Yom Kippur. And again, they were able, that is, Israel was able to be victorious. And the battles pretty much took place in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. But because there was such a concern that they might not have been successful, Israel began to recognize that there was no guarantee that they would always have an ability to dominate the Arab states militarily. And so this really kind of paved the war for subsequent peace negotiations. And perhaps one of the most famous took place under the administration of Jimmy Carter, called the Camp David Accords. And oftentimes I show a picture of two individuals, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Begin, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, Anwar Sadat, the head of Egypt, who, by the way, later was assassinated because he made this peace accord. And thus the decision was to once again remove the troops, Israeli troops, from the Sinai and have kind of a phased withdrawal. So that today you have Israel that takes up about 8,000 square miles, but at its narrowest point is only 9 miles across, because that raises questions, of course, of what will be the future of the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria in your Bible. And as a result, what would happen with the Gaza Strip, which I'll get to in just a minute, and what would happen with the Golan Heights. Which brings us now to some of the modern actions that have taken place. The first was the decision to actually cede back what are called the Gaza Strip area. This is where the old Philistines used to be, and this was a decision being made by the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. He proposed originally a disengagement of Israeli troops back in 2003. It was finally approved by the Knesset in 2005. And then Israeli citizens who actually had land there, but who refused to accept government compensation packages and voluntarily vacate their homes, were actually evicted by the Israeli security forces. And so today, the Gaza Strip is under the rule of Hamas, which is a Sunni Muslim group, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem with that is that, as we've talked about on this program many times before, is there are always tensions between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Israel, where I, again, oftentimes show pictures of Gaza rocket attacks that are launched from Gaza into Israel, some making their way almost to Jerusalem, but certainly a lot of them landing in the Negev. And as a result, this is something where Israel sometimes has to come in and try to address that. But since these rocket platforms are almost always located near civilians, so that there could be collateral damage and thus nationwide and international condemnation that is given against Israel, that's one of the difficulties that they've had. We've also had, of course, the tunnels that were actually being built and constructed so that those in Gaza could actually come out and engage in various terrorist activities. And so as a result, you've had an attempt to try to provide land for peace. And as I oftentimes like to say, how's that working out for you? Hasn't worked out very well with the Gaza Strip. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of other things that have happened as well. And that is the nation of Israel has always occupied what are called the Golan Heights since the 1967 Six-Day War. And they have never been seen as anything other than an occupation, and has never been, up until recently, acknowledged by any government. But that was changing under the administration of Donald Trump. Then we also have the attempt to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Embassy Act was actually passed back in 1995 with various kinds of funds, but did not take place until recently, and we'll talk about that. And then more recently, of course, what about the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria in our Bibles? And this has been currently under the rule of the Palestinian Authority. In the past, it was under the authority of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And interestingly enough, the Trump administration has taken some steps in that regard as well. So when we come back, I want to talk about the three different actions, somewhat unexpected, that were taken by the Trump administration and what that might mean for the future. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, we have posted a couple of articles on our website, pointofview.net, in the past. You can just simply type in Israel or type in West Bank or type in embassy, and you'll find some of those articles that we have found that address some of the things I'll be talking about right after the break. Talking about Israel, and we've been looking at Israel in the past. Let's now look at Israel in the present. We'll talk about these three remarkable actions by the Trump administration right after this.
Psychoanalyst Erica Commissar is a therapist to families and especially children in private practice in New York City. Her periodic columns for the Wall Street Journal on child rearing are treasures. I first noticed the one on why moms should prioritize being home with their babies for their first 3 years. This practical wisdom almost goes without saying. Some of her points might shock or seem retro if they weren't timeless and backed up with stats and tons of experience. Her latest piece concerns the cultural shift surrounding religion, something we Christians lament. Erica Commissar is a practicing Jew. She writes that one of the most important and neglected explanations for the depression and anxiety that is so prevalent among children is declining interest in religion. She cites a 2018 study in the American Journal of Epidemiology in which Harvard researchers looked at 5,000 children or teens who reported that they attended religious services at least once a week. These kids scored higher in psychological well-being and had lower risk of mental illness than their peers who did not attend services. Plus, they were more likely to volunteer, have a sense of mission, to forgive, and were less likely to use drugs or engage in early sexual activity. Ms. Commissar writes, the belief in God, in a protective and guiding figure to rely on when times are tough, is one of the best kinds of support for kids in an increasingly pessimistic world. That's only one reason, from a purely mental health perspective, to pass down a faith tradition. When someone close to a child dies, she writes, belief in heaven helps them grapple with this tremendous and incomprehensible loss. A parent might ask, what if I don't believe? Her shocking counsel? Lie. Much better, explore the claims of Christ. Take your kids to church. Provide them a spiritual center, a buffer, and the natural community of church involvement. For their sake, go and drink deeply. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about Israel, and I wanted to bring you up to date on some of the things that have happened under the Trump administration, at least. And the first of those is the Golan Heights. If you've ever looked at a map, it is in the upper kind of right-hand corner or northeast corner, however you want to say that. And as you might gather, the heights are mountainous. And really, Israel has occupied the Golan Heights really ever since the 1967 Six-Day War. A part of that still remains under the control of Syria and some under the United Nations. Matter of fact, if you go up there today, you will see individuals wearing blue berets who are part of the UN peacekeeping area. But this has been a very strategic strip of land, and David Harsanyi puts it this way, that when the Trump administration finally recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, it was because it's a strategically vital strip of land from which Syria and her proxies have launched numerous wars, bombings, and terror operations against Israeli citizens. And he said many of the people that were critical of this, have to recognize that Israel was never going to hand it back. This is a strategic piece of land that if you had your enemies in the land, in the mountains above you, they can fire rockets down there. And because of the way it is, it provides just a natural barrier and protection. And so it was one of those things which no one wanted to ever acknowledge. But again, I'll give it to the president, Donald Trump, who proclaimed that the United States recognizes that the Golan Heights are part of the state of Israel. It is, again, one of those kind of bold moves that he's been known for, which brings me to the second thing that he has done, and that is the moving of the U.S. Embassy. Now, as we've said on this program before, this was not even in the top 10. I don't even know if it was in the top 10 things that candidate Donald Trump wanted to do. We've even told the story about how he was talking to Gary Bauer and Kelly Shackelford and saying, would this be something that the evangelicals want to know about or would like to hear? And yeah, of course. And so he was so unique in that regard because back in 1995, Congress actually passed what's called the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which provided funds for relocating the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. After all, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It is where the Knesset meets. It is where the prime minister lives. It is where all the major functions of the government actually reside. But there has always been this hope on the part, I would think, of some of the Palestinians and Arabs that maybe it would be split or maybe Israel would relent and actually turn Jerusalem into the capital for the Arab world. It was never going to happen. And yet, even though the funds were provided in 1995, President Bill Clinton promised to move the embassy but did not. Then candidate and then President George W. Bush promised to move the embassy and did not. And then candidate Barack Obama and then president promised to move the embassy and did not. But candidate Donald Trump promised and as president indeed did move the embassy. And first of all, what he did was on December 6, 2017, announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which of course makes sense. Any other nation in the world is allowed to designate what its capital is, and all the other nations recognize that as being the capital. The one exception is Israel, because these various nations around the world want to punish Israel. And so then on the anniversary of the establishment of the nation of Israel on May 14th, 2018, the embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And sometimes I even show a picture of my wife and I standing in front of the plaque there in the embassy just to illustrate that. And if those two actions were not enough, the third one is even more surprising in some respects, because the big question has always been what to do with the West Bank. What you have had is ever since 1993, the Oslo Accords, which in part took place under the Clinton administration, actually were signed by Israel and then what's called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Now these areas are run by what's called the Palestinian Authority, and there are three different administrative districts, A, B, and C. Some run just by Israel, some run by the Palestinian Authority, and others run by kind of a joint venture. But interestingly enough, in November of 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the U.S. would no longer hold the position that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are inconsistent with international law. Before that announcement was even made, I might just point out that the Trump administration had taken a year to really consult experts in international law. And the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said that the settlements are not inherently illegal. He argued that the West Bank's fate should be determined through negotiations, and really said that attacking the settlements hasn't advanced the cause of peace. And, of course, a lot of people have said it's really hard to say that Israel occupies Palestinian territories because the nation of Palestine never existed. And Jordan, interestingly enough, had at one point been given control over the West Bank all the way back to 1949, but it never officially took it and really has refused any offer to give it to them. So we are in this sort of state of flux, which will exist, I think, forever, because there's probably no way that many of the Arab communities in the West Bank will ever integrate with Israel. There's no way that Israel is going to simply allow this kind of nation next to them to exist when the stated goal of some of the Palestinians is to destroy the nation of Israel and to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean. So this is, of course, the current state we find ourselves in right now. But if nothing else, just an illustration that over time, some things that have always been talked about by previous administrations actually were done by the Trump administration. And as we come to an end, let me just also mention that as we talk about Israel and as we talk about some of the anger that people have towards Israel, towards Jewish people, it's relevant to the booklet I'm holding up right now on anti-Semitism. This is one of the booklets we've made available because we recognize that Israel is only part of this, and Jewish people, not only in Israel but around the world, still face a level of anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, even in this country, they talk about the fact that hate crimes have increased. But if you go back and look at those, a majority of those are against Jewish people. And so really, it's probably fair to say that it's still a reality that the oldest hatred and bigotry in the world still is unfortunately alive and well in the 21st century. So as Christians, what can we do? Well, we are admonished to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I think we need to understand some of our history and some of the history of Israel, and that's why I wanted to give you a short, and believe me, this is short, summary of the nation of Israel from Genesis 12 to where we find ourselves right now. And if nothing else, recognize that we should pay attention to what elected candidates or even candidates and elected officials say about Israel, because after all, it is still one of our best friends in the Middle East, sometimes our only friend in the Middle East, and a nation, whether you accept some of the promises in Genesis 12 or not, is a nation that we need to keep alliances with and need to understand their life and their circumstances that they find themselves in right now. So that's just a kind of a quick summary of this. Let me again recommend a couple of books. Everlasting Hatred by Hal Lindsey. Of course, I mentioned Joel Rosenberg's book, Epicenter, and many others that really give you a very good history of Israel. And I've tried to bring it up to date to some of the actions that have been taking place fairly recently on everything from the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the embassy, and even the West Bank. That's all we have this hour right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and we have Chelsey and Kelly here with us, and we're going to talk a little bit more about their organizations later, which are in order: Human Coalition Action and First Liberty. And, of course, two lawyers here, so I'm really going to enjoy this conversation because, as you well know, or maybe you are just now finding out, the House Judiciary Committee eventually voted, that was early this morning, on a party-line vote, 23-17, to accept both articles of impeachment, which will now then be sent to the House for a vote. And if indeed that is accepted there, we'll go on to the United States Senate. So we'll talk about this indeed. Some of the criticism coming from, for example, Doug Collins. Mr. Chairman, there was no consulting with the ranking member on your schedule for tomorrow. You just blew up the schedule. You chose not to consult the ranking member on the scheduling issue. This is a kangaroo court we're talking about. That has to do with the fact that instead of voting on a Thursday night, they actually took a recess and voted on a Friday, but we'll get to that. But I also, somewhat along the line, and it might even end up being in the second hour, want to talk about something else that's happened in the UK, because Boris Johnson represents the Conservative power and the Conservative Party as well. They now have 365 seats in the House of Commons. That's the best performance they have done, that is, the Conservative Party have done, since Margaret Thatcher, which goes back to 1987. And part of it is there were people saying that there was an attempt by Jeremy Corbyn, the socialist, to try to overturn a previous election, which is Brexit. That sounds familiar. And that they were rejecting the socialist ideas of Jeremy Corbyn. So I don't know, maybe there's some lessons to be learned there from the UK. And, of course, there's also an agreement with China. We've posted a couple of articles on unraveling corruption at the FBI. We have some judicial confirmation. We've got a lot of things to cover here today. So, Chelsey, always great to have you, and thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here because there's no shortage of current events for us to go through.
That is for sure. Let me just real quickly, because people really enjoy the conversations we have about religious liberty, and I know I won't see Kelly again till the end of this year. You're going to be joining us for our year end, January 31st. So one of the things we mentioned yesterday, but I want you to go in more detail, is a school district in New York doesn't seem to understand that back in, 1984, there was an equal access law. If I do my math, that's 35 years ago. So it's not like this is something new. You should know that there's an equal access law that says to this young freshman, if you want to start a Christian club or a Bible club, you have the same rights as starting a debate club or a ski club or a Spanish club or whatever, right?
Yeah, unless you're going to talk about Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, there's the problem.
That was the problem.
That's the problem.
You can't talk about Jesus. Oh, no, not if you're going to be, quote, too religious. That was what they said. I mean, these are like, it's like, okay, attorneys, what would you like them to say to set up your case?
Yes.
Well, I want them to say, don't be too religious, and I want them to say, don't talk about Jesus, and that's what they did. But the main thing is, I think people need to understand they push, you've got somebody who the law was on their side. They just said, we want to be a club. They delayed, then they lost the application.
Oh, dear.
Then there was one thing after another. So just realize you can't be bullied the way they bullied, these folks. And all you have to do is stand your ground and eventually force your way, and they're going to have to follow the law. And they've already, this was a quick victory. It was a long victory for our client because they've been fighting the entire year just to get them to follow the law. But as soon as we said, okay, The lights are now on you. Everybody is watching. All of a sudden, they decided maybe they should follow the law. So this is what's amazing is on almost the same day, I think, we had our case in Delaware with the nativity scene.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. It's like, well, we can't allow you to put up a nativity scene because that's religious. It's like, yeah, it's religious, and you're the government, and you can't discriminate against religion. You can't say you can speak something, but you can't say something religious. Or you can put displays up. Oh, but you can't put, a manger scene up because that's religious. That's unconstitutional. So in both cases, we have in Delaware and in New York, I think it's New York, if I'm not mistaken, they don't understand the law. They think that it's their job. And in fact, this is after our victory in the Bladensburg Cross
This is
case,
what is so amazing about all this.
There's, it's not even a question anymore, any of these types of things, because there's nothing wrong with religious displays in public. That's what our country really was built upon, was a country with religious heritage, religious freedom, and secular. You're going to see all kinds of monuments of religious and non-religious. It's okay to have religious and non-religious groups. It's okay to have religious and non-religious displays. And the idea that you have to ban all the religious displays is not the law, never has been the law.
Chelsey, let me come to you because we've posted the first article is on the equal access case. That's a victory. Second one on the nativity scene. But the reason I wanted to bring these up is not only victories, but if you go to First Liberty, there are all sorts of things. You can click on school, military, house of worship, community. And if I remember right, you wrote some of those little brochures that people can have. And we're going to be going through this again. There are going to be other kids that are going to be say that they can't sing a Christian song. They can't deliver a valedictorian speech because it has Jesus in it. So there's a real need to recognize that the law is on our sides, and we really need to educate young people. This young lady who was just a freshman understood this, and if I remember right, actually passed to them the Equal Access Act. But just imagine if she said, well, I guess I can't do that, and just faded off into the background.
Right. I just think this is so important to understand because we live in a culture that we are really used to as Christians, just a large hostility towards our religion. And if you live in California, like my sister, she says nobody talks about being a Christian at work, anywhere. It's just, you're almost hush-hush about it. But to remember that politics is downstream of culture, the law is downstream of politics. And if women like this young woman do not stand up, or men who are, pushed back against for their beliefs or even fired for their beliefs, if they don't stand up for their beliefs, eventually they will no longer have the laws protecting them. So this is just a great case to understand that it's so important to stand up for your rights and to push back against that culture, because law will ultimately be downstream of culture.
That is so good. One other one I want to put on the table. I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because I think most people want to hear what your comments are about impeachment. But if you go to our website, you'll notice that we have a take action item that used to be there, and it was the take action item to encourage your senators to confirm Lawrence Van Dyke. But that's not on the website anymore because he's been confirmed.
He was confirmed, yeah. Lawrence Van Dyke, boy, there's a lot of great things to talk about this. I don't know if we can hit it all before the break, but number one, this week, the Lawrence Van Dyke was the 50th appellate judge confirmation. To help people understand that, in 3 years, this administration has now gotten 50 federal court of appeals judges confirmed. In 8 years, President Obama got 55. So you can see how quickly they're moving, number one. And then number two, Lawrence, what kind of guy is he? Well, I don't know. Number one, his class from Harvard and Solicitor General of 2 different states. And his first argument ever, oral argument, was on a First Liberty case.
Yeah.
So he was a guy who gave his time for religious freedom. And he's so conservative that I'm liberal compared to him. And where is he confirmed? The Ninth Circuit.
Yes.
So you talk about change?
Yeah.
That's change.
And that's kind of that idea of flipping the courts. When we come back, I want to hear both of your comments about that. And if you want to kind of keep track of that, at First Liberty, they have kind of a scorecard that you can figure that out. But we need to take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with Kelly and Chelsey right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Lately, politicians on both the left and the right have been criticizing capitalism. Senator Elizabeth Warren calls for accountable capitalism. Senator Marco Rubio proposes what could be called common good capitalism. And Senator Bernie Sanders proposes democratic socialism as an alternative to unfettered capitalism. By the way, they aren't the only ones using the term. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz argues in his book, The Bit of Everything, for a new social contract. He says we need to get rid of the kind of selfish, unfettered capitalism we've had for the last 40 years. Jonah Goldberg, in a recent column, asked the same question I've been asking. What on earth are these people talking about? Decades ago, during the progressive era, presidents did all they could to restrain capitalism. Teddy Roosevelt broke up the trust, and Franklin D. Roosevelt created dozens of government restraints during the New Deal. Jonah Goldberg asked another good question. If you think there are no restraints on the market or on economic activity, why on earth do we have the Department of Labor, HHS, HUD, FDA, EPA, OSHA, and the IRS? Yes, our economy sometimes benefits certain people and organizations more than others. This isn't because of unfettered capitalism. It's due to the fetters government puts on certain sectors of our society to the benefit of others. It's called crony capitalism. Laws and bureaucratic regulations benefit select businesses and industries in agriculture, manufacturing, banking, and a variety of other fields. So if you think the government needs to spend more or regulate more or tax more, then make your case for doing so. But let's stop arguing against the straw man of unfettered capitalism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, there's this thing called the impeachment inquiry, but it's more than just an impeachment inquiry now. It's articles of impeachment. I've got two lawyers sitting across from me, Kelly and Chelsey, and so I want to get some of their comments. But the bottom line is simply this. If you believe that it's got to be, treason, bribery, high crimes, or misdemeanors, there's 4 categories, but I don't see abuse of power or obstruction of Congress. But I'm going to turn it over to our lawyers. The obstruction issue is really questionable because if indeed the president or any individual exerts executive privilege, well, you solve that in the courts. So this could be solved if there's a problem with obstruction of Congress. So the other one, abuse of power, well, that goes back to a July 25th phone call, and we've had a chance to read the transcript. So, Kelly, start us off. I'd just love to get your thoughts about this. You are a lawyer. You've been looking at this for years, and what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that this is silly. Anybody who's looking at this from a legal standpoint, it's embarrassing. And I think the American people are beginning to come to that conclusion. They haven't been paying close attention to all the details. But they've been trying to impeach this president since the day he was inaugurated, and I think that's really, I think this is really damaging what they're doing because, and you go back, I think I read the de Tocqueville quote last time I was on Point of View, the fact that de Tocqueville said, in like the early 1800s, I guess, is when he wrote his book on America. And he said that whenever America gets to a point where it loses its moral, undergirdings, you'll see impeachment used as a political process. Mm-hmm. And I thought, golly, that guy was smart,
Yes.
Because we're watching it happen. Now it'll be everybody wants to use impeachment. That's not what it's for. It's for a high crime and misdemeanor. It's for something at an incredibly serious level. And what's going on here doesn't even come near being a high crime and misdemeanor. I mean, obstruction of Congress, that's a joke. I mean, the president has executive privilege. The idea that the Congress can just call anybody who works for the president to come and say anything they want to has never been the case. And if you have a dispute, you go to court and you let the court decide, okay, what is covered by privilege or not. But they were in a rush to get to impeachment. They said, no, we don't have time to do the court thing. So instead of us do our job, we're going to say that that's a reason to impeach him. Well, that's just silly. And then the other one, the abuse of power. Again, if you look at the articles of impeachment very carefully, what they're really saying, because let's go back to a basic. What is the act that they're saying is the act? Well, the act is the president asking the president of the Ukraine to investigate Burisma, the company, for corruption. Is there anything wrong with any president doing that? No, Obama did it.
Mm-hmm.
Obama said the same thing. Okay, so the act isn't wrong. So how is this abuse of power or abuse of whatever they want to call it? Well, if you look in the impeachment articles, what they say is that even if you do a thing that is okay and that is legal, perfectly legal, and even good for our country, it can be impeachable if your motives were to advance yourself personally. Well, if that's the new standard, every politician needs to be impeached because they're always advancing their own interests. So it's just bizarre. I mean, again, there's argument about was there a quid pro quo? Was there all that's irrelevant to me. What he asked him to do was fine. It's okay for the president to ask a head of another country to investigate corruption. And that's what he did. But in this case, they're saying, well, but he had some motives to help himself in the process. It's just, this is so far away from, high crime and misdemeanor. And I really think it's backfiring. And it's just the beginning of the backfiring. I think it's going to continue. People are going to go, they're going to pay attention to this right now a little bit. And then Christmas is going to come. And then the trial's going to come back. And people are going to go, really?
Yeah.
We're still dealing with this silliness? And then the trial's probably going to go in a little bit. And then it's going to be time for the election. And I think by then, people are going to be tired of this. They're going to say, and you've got Democrats now saying, a number of them, well, even if this doesn't work, if he's elected again, we're going to impeach him again. Well, okay. I think the American people will say, I think maybe it's time to empty the House of Democrats if this is what they're going to do, because they need to be doing things for the American people instead of spending all their time trying to impeach the president that they don't like.
Donald Trump said numbers have gone through the roof in favor of no impeachment, especially the swing states and independents. Of course, he was also talking about going through the roof in terms of the energy on the Republican side and the fundraising. And that's why at least one wag in Washington, D.C. said, I wonder if the whistleblower was actually Donald Trump, because he's the one that's the beneficiary of all this.
I know. It's, I think the country's fatigued at this point. They're not even following this story anymore. I think last week we talked about there are some commercials that are getting watched more than the impeachment hearings online. So really the country's fatigued, and that's going to continue to just be a referendum on Democrats' credibility over the next year. And fortunate for us as a democracy, in spite of Democrats' best attempts to undermine our democracy through this process, we will have a vote, and we will have a vote next November. We'll have one in March, and be able to really let them know how we feel about them wasting our taxpayer dollars and, frankly, their jobs on this type of just joke court, kangaroo court hearing that they're holding. On the legal side, I did look up the federal standards for bribery under the act, and for one standard, by the way, you can't even apply it to foreign officials. So that one was out. And then they tried the other definition for bribery. And the only thing that there's even a question about is what Kelly was speaking to earlier. Is there a corrupt motive? But it has to be a high level of corruptions. Courts don't use a loosey-goosey standard with that's being applied here. It is extremely common in foreign affairs, not only for aid to have string attached to foreign countries. That's really the only reason we give or withhold aid. Is to encourage or discourage foreign country on our interests, right? That's Department of State 101. And then two, for corruption to be a high level of interest for us to a country we are giving aid. That's really important, especially to know if there's corruption at the governing level. Now, we all know that Trump probably had a personal interest in that, but does it rise to the level of strong corruption? No, it doesn't. At this point, I think the country is where voters are smart. They're aware of this. They know what's going on. They can call it political gamesmanship. Unfortunately, and I keep coming back to this, there are just such high ramifications for undermining democracy. I mean, this goes to the core of our Constitution. It goes to the core of our republic. And I think that we need to be aware of the consequences of this type of gamesmanship.
And we haven't even talked about the massive abusive process that the House engaged in by not having due process. I mean, again, I think people immediately look at that and they think, well, if they're not going to give the president due process, then maybe I'm in trouble. You know, if the president doesn't get due process, I mean, this is dangerous. If this is the mindset, if they would do that to him, they would do it to me. And that's what you got to understand. If you let the government do things like this, treat people this way, they're going to treat you this way. And so that's one of the damaging things. And again, that's what I love about this. So every 2 years, the House everybody is up for election. And I think people are going to respond to this. And the only thing that I think is up in the air, because, I mean, there's no question, everybody's watching this and everybody's going, well, we know it's going to happen when it goes to the Senate.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to get 20 Republicans and all the in fact, they'll probably lose some Democrat votes.
I don't think Manchin's going to vote for it. Go ahead.
Yeah. But the only thing that's interesting is what is going to be the approach in the Senate. There's a debate. I was just in D.C. this week, and there's a debate. Is there, do you want to do kind of each side has their attorneys give their statements, their arguments, and then they say, this is bogus. There's no even reason to go on. We dismiss this. Gone. Case over. Or do they want to say, no, we want to bring some witnesses.
Oh, yes.
We want Hunter Biden. We want some of these other people to show the American people who haven't gotten a chance to see the full information what an absolute joke this is. As attorneys, you're always told, you don't want to go to trial if you don't have to go to trial, right? You're not sure what's going to happen. But there's a part of me that looks at this and goes, I see a lot of upside and maybe not a lot of downside. I just think a little more information and finally letting the due process occur of letting the other information get out might be, and I've heard that that's what the president wants.
Of course, yeah.
And he'll probably end up getting what he wants because McConnell is going to eventually defer to the president and his counsel as to what approach they want.
Well, we said around this table before, sunlight is a great disinfectant, so maybe let's bring it all out into the light and we'll see. We're going to take a break, but I want to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Have you been watching the whole issue of impeachment, the impeachment inquiry? What about the thoughts about the articles of impeachment? What about this idea that if it does indeed go to the Senate, you do it quick and dismiss it, or let it go for a long time and give the American people a real spectacle of what's taking place? And of course, when you say, if this could happen to the president, we'll look at the IG report later, because some people said, could that happen to me as well?
That's right.
So we got a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Kelly and Chelsea with us today, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's, if we can, before we get into the IG report, just talk about a couple of other issues of impeachment. Kelly, last week we had Dr. Merrill Matthews and Chelsea in studio with us, and we were talking about 266,000 new jobs in December. Again, the record unemployment, the best since 1969, more than 50 years. And this gets back to one of the comments that you made just in passing, and that is the Democrats have been saying that the president did this for his own personal benefit. And Representative Matt Gaetz, boy, he come out of the woodwork here from Florida, said, and a very powerful thing, if he's doing this for his own benefit, look at how the American people are benefiting. 266,000 new jobs, unemployment at record levels, and the stock market exploding, and on and on and on. Is there at least some possibility that these articles of impeachment are being rushed so quickly simply because you want to change the narrative from a lot of good news in the economy?
Well, there's no doubt. There's no look, when you impeachment, the way it's set up is for a high crime and misdemeanor. You cannot get a removal unless you have 2/3 of the senators, which means you always have to have the other party. The only way to do that is to have a bipartisan process. That's what we've always done in the impeachment. They didn't do that here, which immediately tells you they were never trying to remove him and follow the normal impeachment. They wanted to smear him and affect the election, which, again, is a total misuse. And I think they don't understand their history, because every time this has been tried, it has not worked out well. I mean, there was a time back when they were trying to impeach judges and others because they didn't like their opinions or whatever. And it turned out that when you did this, you usually paid a price. And so they stopped that kind of thing. And they said, no, it's only if it's really a high crime or a bribery or whatever. And they've forgotten their history. And so it's obvious that the only reason they're doing this, they're not doing this because they think he committed a high crime and misdemeanor and they want to remove him from office, because they would have allowed due process. There's no way you're going to get Republicans if you treat him unfairly, if you don't provide him due process, if you don't allow the president's attorney to be in those, like you did with Nixon and Clinton and everybody else. So it's obvious that their whole purpose is let's smear the president. That's why they want to go very fast, get this done before Christmas. Again, that's not what you do if you're trying to get to the truth, if you're trying to look at a real, you don't, that's just not, they show their true, motives and what they're after by how they act. And so it's all a political, circus and as a result. And everybody's watching the polls, and they've been focus grouping daily. I mean, remember they switched to bribery because the focus group said for them to switch to bribery the last few days. I mean, this is just really sad. I mean, it's sad to watch. It really is. And you'd hope that both parties would be grown up enough not to do this kind of thing. And the only thing I'm grateful for is that it's backfiring, because maybe, just maybe, that will stop both sides, because otherwise the Republicans would go, well, if they're going to do that to us when we get power, we're going to do that to them. And then back and forth, it would be forever. We would just have ruined, our system of government. But I think maybe the lesson will be that the backlash from this is going to be so harmful that people will learn, I'm not going to do this again. I hope that's what happens.
I really thought it was interesting, your point earlier, Kelly, about what will the Senate do now, because truthfully, that's the only chance and opportunity our country has at fairness and at transparency, and seeing what the defenses are. And, in any trial, in any court of law, there's two sides. The prosecution puts on their case and the defense gets to put on their case. And so really to have that fair, equal system that we are now required to have, almost because of what the Democrats are doing, I think there's a lot of legitimacy to that. And, with Nixon, there was almost a year's worth of investigation, maybe more, just to make sure that it was a credible process and one that ultimately did become bipartisan. And we're never going to see that here, because the Democrats are wasting precious time. They have a primary to look for. I mean, they have to pick their next leader. And I think that they thought they would land the plane on this soon and fast, so that then they could roll into their primaries. And that's not going to be the case. They have to account for the process they started. One
of the telling things right now is that, I don't know, there was a story today I read, I think, about how it might have been Peggy Noonan, but it was one of them that was talking about how the candidates who are running for office in the Democratic Party, this tells you how bad the impeachment thing is going. None of them really want to talk about it. And nobody's asking questions about it because nobody cares. Because it's like, how can impeachment be not even the political story? And it shows you a little something that people just look at it and they see it for what it is. It's not really impeachment. It's sort of a political attack and all this. And so when the Democratic candidates for president are not even really leading on this, wanting to talk about this, et cetera, you know something has gone awry with the plan.
Well, and I'm thinking those Democratic candidates who are senators are not going to like this, because just think about this. February 3rd is the Iowa caucus. By the time you then have Iowa, you have New Hampshire, and of course you have South Carolina and Nevada. But then by March 3rd, you have a Super Tuesday, and this is a super duper Tuesday. We've had Super Tuesdays before, but we've never had California in there with Texas and everything else. By the end of that week, you also have Louisiana. By next week, you have a super duper once again primary on March 10th, and they're all sitting there saying, we don't want to be sitting in a trial in the United States Senate, because they sit like jurors, right? And they don't want to be sitting there. So if your name is Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, of course you can go down the list.
Cory Booker,
yeah, Cory Booker, all the rest. Maybe Amy Klobuchar is gone and all that, but I mean, still, you've got some individuals that would be harmed tremendously by this, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, I think they would. I don't think that's why. I don't think that's going to be a part of the strategy for how they do this.
Maybe not.
I know Majority Leader McConnell said, and he really controls. I mean, it's a majority vote, and there's 53 Republicans, and the way the Senate really works is the Majority Leader kind of controls everything. And he said just the other day that he's going to do whatever the President's Council wants to do, whatever approach. So whether that's but I saw Senator Graham, the Judiciary Committee chairman, say that he thinks they should do a sort of a each side gives its arguments kind of a thing. In other words, no witnesses, what we would typically think of in a trial.
Yeah.
And so we'll just see. I mean, but I think ultimately it's going to be what the president wants. And
but the Chief Justice has to be there, and the senators have to be there.
Yes.
Now, there have been talk about they would meet in the morning, but then they would still confirm judicial nominees in the afternoon. There's all sorts of possibilities.
See,
right?
What the rules are, though, and this is one of the things that concerns me, the rules are that you're not allowed. Supposedly, when an impeachment trial starts, the Senate is not allowed to do other business.
Wow.
So
that ends that
it could
idea.
shut everything down while that's going on.
Yeah, it's a real-time trial. I mean, it's a trial of our president. And I looked up the leading Democrats in the first 4 states for that February primary. I mean, it is at the top of the list. First is Joe Biden, but under that is Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Cory Booker. And so all 3 of them will be off the campaign trail, presumably, and involved in this. So it's just a miscalculation in so many ways.
Mayor Pete and Joe Biden are saying, this is great. Let's just have this thing last as long as it can.
But if this thing, if there is a trial where witnesses are called, I think the person that will be harmed the most will be Joe Biden.
Oh, for
because I think most people have no idea about the facts that we're aware of with China. I mean, China investing over $1 billion. I mean, in his sons, who has no experience, in investments, and the idea that China is doing that while he's vice president, that not even we haven't even got to Ukraine yet, right? And then you get to the Ukraine. I mean, most people won't know all these facts, and when it comes out, it will not look very good for Joe Biden. And I'm not talking about whether that's a crime or anything else. It's just bad
perception.
Yeah, it looks
and
really
it's important.
bad.
I always say the truth rises to the surface, and so they open this bag of worms, and now we have to deal with it. And the American people deserve to know, if we're going through all of this investigation with all of these witnesses, they deserve to know, if Joe Biden is the Democrat candidate, what how he has utilized his positions in the Department of State to benefit himself.
Let's take a break. I'll take a phone call, but then I do want to get your comments about the Inspector General report, Michael Horowitz, and whether you think there was any political bias involved in all of that. And we found out there were a lot more people surveilled. I think another word that the Attorney General uses, spied on, than we might have known. So there's all sorts of things to talk about. We'll take some phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with your calls and more content right after this.
Psychoanalyst Erica Commissar is a therapist to families and especially children in private practice in New York City. Her periodic columns for the Wall Street Journal on child rearing are treasures. I first noticed the one on why moms should prioritize being home with their babies for their first 3 years. This practical wisdom almost goes without saying. Some of her points might shock or seem retro if they weren't timeless and backed up with stats and tons of experience. Her latest piece concerns the cultural shift surrounding religion, something we Christians lament. Erica Commissar is a practicing Jew. She writes that one of the most important and neglected explanations for the depression and anxiety that is so prevalent among children is declining interest in religion. She cites a 2018 study in the American Journal of Epidemiology in which Harvard researchers looked at 5,000 children or teens who reported that they attended religious services at least once a week. These kids scored higher in psychological well-being and had lower risk of mental illness than their peers who did not attend services. Plus, they were more likely to volunteer, have a sense of mission, to forgive, and were less likely to use drugs or engage in early sexual activity. Ms. Commissar writes, the belief in God, in a protective and guiding figure to rely on when times are tough, is one of the best kinds of support for kids in an increasingly pessimistic world. That's only one reason, from a purely mental health perspective, to pass down a faith tradition. When someone close to a child dies, she writes, belief in heaven helps them grapple with this tremendous and incomprehensible loss. A parent might ask, what if I don't believe? Her shocking counsel? Lie. Much better, explore the claims of Christ. Take your kids to church. Provide them a spiritual center, a buffer, and the natural community of church involvement. For their sake, go and drink deeply. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Have Kelly and Chelsey here, and before it's all through, we will spend some time talking about both of these organizations, great organizations for you to know more about. And as we come to year-end, I encourage you to support both of those. Matter of fact, I've been supporting First Liberty for a long time, and I'm going to be sending some stuff to Human Coalition because I think very highly of both of the work that you both do. Let's go to South Carolina first. Kathy, I think you have some questions for the panelists, so I'm going to sit back and let you ask those. Do we have Kathy there? Kathy, you there?
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Gotcha.
Okay. I have been wondering, with all of this is happening and this keeps dragging on and on and on, and like everybody said, there's not really a lot of information that says they should be doing this. We as the American people, they're wasting our tax dollars, as you've said before. Why can't we have a lawsuit against the ones that are in there doing this to get back money that they've wasted of our tax money.
Well, the great question, because I think what you're expressing is what a lot of Americans feel, and I think it's going to only increase over the next few months as they get through the trial. The quick answer is there is what we call legislative immunity. The Constitution gives immunity to our legislators from being sued for what they do on the floor of the legislature. I mean, it doesn't mean your legislator can go kill somebody outside of the legislature, but as far as for them doing their work, even badly or wrongly or whatever, there's an immunity because we want people to be free to argue, to do everything they need to do. So you could not sue them. There is a remedy, though. I mean, that is why the House. I mean, who did this? It wasn't the Senate. It was the House that impeached. The House, unlike the Senate, if you only run for office every 6 years, so it's staggered. A third of the Senate is up every 2 years. The House is the one that's directly responsible to the people in the greatest way, and that is why every single one of those people has to go for re-election every 2 years. So if you don't like what your particular representative is doing, you need to be telling them now, and you need to throw them out of office if they're doing the wrong thing. That's the whole point. And so there is a remedy for what you're expressing and what I think Americans are feeling, but it's not a legal remedy. It's a political remedy, and it's a matter of, there's a lot of people I know of that this is the kind of thing that makes them so mad, and nobody's running, and they say, well, I'll just run.
Yeah.
And
go do it.
And it starts. So either find somebody good or if there's not somebody running. But I think this is where, I think back to the Balk Springs story with the senior citizens who were told they couldn't pray in their senior center. And these 4 city council members did this. And anyway, they stood up. They said, this is wrong. You're telling me we can't pray over our meals and all this. Well, by the end of the case, not only had they won, but they had woken up the entire community to the fact that these 4 all-powerful city council members weren't so all-powerful, and they held a recall election and threw all 4 of them out of office. And then what I loved is about 2 years later, I got a postcard from one of the seniors because she was letting me know that she was now one of the new city council members.
That's so good.
And I think that's
the remedy.
That's America.
That
that's what people need to do. If you have a bunch of childish representatives, you need to replace them with some adults.
I think so. Well, again, Kathy, thank you for your question. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I want to get your comments about the Inspector General report, and we've posted a piece here that actually comes from Real Clear Politics about one of those individuals who, if you're going to get somebody to turn, is the individual we now know his name, who actually changed some of the emails. But this is interesting because Michael Horowitz, who is the Inspector General for the Justice Department, puts out his 475-page report Monday. Within hours, you have first the Attorney General, Bill Barr, and then even later, John Durham, who's a man who says very little, very, very, very rarely anything. And both of them are saying, we really just don't agree with what's there. And I cannot remember a time, Kelly Shackelford, when you've had a report coming from the Justice Department, which as soon as it comes out, the Attorney General, who is your boss, says, well, we really don't agree with some of the conclusions in the report.
Well, I mean, I think it's somewhat understandable because the Inspector General Horowitz is limited to current employees.
He's going to talk to the Justice Department only.
He can't go outside of that and get any other information.
I understand that.
But the other thing is, if you look at Horowitz, I mean, look at what he did on the last, report he released about Comey. I mean, kind of what he does is he's like, he'll lay out all the horrible things that are going on, but he won't come to the most obvious conclusion.
Right.
He's almost like he would be a horrible judge because it's like he comes across and there's a body and there's a knife in the body, and in fact there's somebody with their hand on the knife and he will say, well, there is a knife, there's a body, there's a person with a hand, but there's not definitive proof that they stuck that knife in that person. And so he stopped short. And so that's kind of what he does. And that's what he did here. He said a bunch of things, and people tried to say he said things he didn't say. For instance, they said that he said that there was no political
Bias.
or this wasn't politically based. He said he couldn't find evidence to definitively prove it was or it wasn't.
Well said.
Yeah. And I think anybody with a brain, though, that looks at it goes, well, there's not any other explanation. Once this started, and they create this, going to the FISA court, which is is a secretive court we have, so that you can go and you can get wiretaps and et cetera on foreign. Okay, so this is our way to spy on foreign individuals. Okay, and if you go, though, you have to bring forward verified information. Well, what they came forward with to spy on an American, they knew within a short amount of time was totally baseless. Yet they continued to go back to reissue that. Well, why would anybody do that? Even if their original motivation was a good one, the fact that they're doing that tells you that something is up here. And you start looking at the comments like, we need to get, we have an insurance plan if Trump gets elected, and you got all these texts and everything going back and forth. It doesn't take anybody to understand, what's going on. But I just think we should have almost extra protections that the intelligence, our intelligence folks should never. There should be extra protection for a political campaign for the president of the United States. But the idea that if they will do this to the president, they will do it to you. I mean, that's obvious, and this is really disturbing activity.
Yeah, you got me back to that point. And when we come back from the break, I'd love to hear from Chelsey, because that's the point. We already said this. If they've done this to the president on the issue of impeachment, and they've done this to individuals like Carter Page, who are somewhat significant, and even ultimately to the president himself in his campaign, look at the danger to us. And a lot of people say, well, even if I can see that there was no political bias, does that make you feel good that we use something that is used as an instrument to go after foreign terrorists in this country? We use this to go after a man, Carter Page, when they knew full well, to use one of your favorite legal terms, they had exculpatory information, and they simply ignored all of that. That should not make you feel good. So let's take a break.
They even doctored evidence. Yeah. It wasn't like a mistake.
Yeah, and that's the article we've got here. I think is our fourth article there. You can read. And we're going to take a break and come back. I see some phone calls getting in, so we'll get to those. But if nothing else, we have a lot more to talk about, including the fact that next week we have another Democratic debate. And we want to talk about what this means for some of these Democratic candidates. All that coming up right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing, I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Again, we have in studio with us today Chelsey Youman, and she is again with Human Coalition Action. Kelly Shackelford, of course, with First Liberty. And before we're done, I want to talk about those organizations because they are certainly worthy of your financial support. And before we get into the campaign, because after all, we have another Democratic debate next week. I loved what one of the Democratic leaders said. We have a debate of the Democratic presidential candidates 6 days before Christmas, because our leaders are idiots. Or I guess he said morons. Even Democrats will say, why are we doing this next week? So I want to talk about that. But just for a few minutes, Kelly and I were talking off air, and it's something I was going to cover. We have talked about how this economy is booming, even in the midst of a trade war. Well, guess what? President Trump, I'll read one tweet. You can read the other one if you want. We have agreed to a very large phase one deal with China. They have agreed to many structural changes and massive purchases of agricultural produce, energy, manufacturing goods, plus much more. The 25% tariffs will remain as is, with a 7.25% much remainder. So that was originally the idea, but then since then, the argument is that this could perhaps lead to what, $50 billion in agricultural products, something like that?
Yeah, my favorite is, his typical Trump phrase. He says, and I want to speak to my friend the farmers. He says they're going to have to buy bigger tractors because there's going to be a lot more business. And I thought only Trump would say it that way. But I think I really appreciate it. I've seen a lot of the farmers and a lot of the people that have been impacted by the tariffs. And they said, yeah, it's hurting us, but we understand what's going on. That, if we just continually let China just rip us off, steal our intellectual property, do what they're doing, our country, we just can't do that. And so they understand that long term it's going to be very good. It's just you have to fight. You have to be willing to fight, or some people will steal from you. Mm-hmm. And that's what's been happening. And now, that's beginning to have an impact. China, it's phase one. There's going to be a number of phases.
Right.
So he's keeping the tariffs on because otherwise they wouldn't meet the other, phases. But I thought it was pretty funny. He said you need to buy much bigger tractors
because there's going to be a lot more business. Just the other day, I guess it was on the 11th, December 11th, I had a commentary on foreign policy in which I was saying, most people did not elect Donald Trump for foreign policy issues. And I talked about China and Iran and North Korea. And in every case, he's had some limited success. And China, Chelsey, is a good example of that. And that is that up until this particular president, there were other presidents, and I'm talking about presidents all the way back to even maybe when you were born, but certainly all through the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century and now, who all just said, yeah, but what can we do? And there was sort of a throwing up of a hands. There's nothing we can do. And Donald Trump came into office and said, I know something we can do. We can fight back. And that has been something that certainly has angered a few people, but I think a lot of people understand that if indeed we've had such an economic boom with the trade war, imagine what it's going to look like next year if we don't have a trade war.
That's absolutely accurate. I just think this is another perfect example of promises kept by the Trump administration. Yes. He ran. Yeah, I'll be the first. I always say this. I'll admit when I'm wrong. I was curious when he was running for the presidency about how much he was actually going to put pen to paper, because he didn't look like a traditional conservative prior to his administration. And this is a perfect example of him saying, I will be strong for America to make America great again. We have to get out of unequal bargaining power relationships and trade relationships. He ran on this issue. We knew what he was going to do, and he made good on that promise. And I think our economy is flourishing and will flourish even more because of it. So there are definitely in conservative economics a place for tariffs. I've done some research on it, and for a limited amount of time, for a specific purpose, with the right foreign entity, they're very effective. And I think we're seeing that. Only history will show really the benefit of this. And luckily, we've had almost a year now to see it start to show. Can't wait for the State of the Union in January, when we get to get a full summary from him of all the good he's doing, because we don't always get to see it. It gets buried. The lead gets buried a little bit.
Well, one of the other big promises is judges. And I'm looking, I just got a copy of the numbers. On this date, and all the other presidents, Barack Obama had gotten 24 circuit judges, federal court of appeals judges confirmed, 24. George W. Bush, 30. Bill Clinton, 27. George Herbert Walker Bush, 31. Ronald Reagan, 23. Jimmy Carter, 45, because there was just a ton open.
Yeah.
Anyway, Trump, 50. So, I mean, he's almost at double everybody else. And so that was a huge promise. It was, for evangelicals, it was the number one issue. 81% voted for Trump, and the number one polling issue was they did it because of Supreme Court justices and the judges. So
promises kept.
I think it's important to note, just without the partisan component of that, is that our judicial system needed it. I mean, there were so many district courts and circuit courts that their dockets were literally years behind. And those are U.S. citizens not having access to the court system that they need to go about their daily lives and do their business. And so that really is a win for anyone in the American public who needs access to quick judicial remedies. So I think that both sides of the aisle could celebrate that. I don't know if they will, but they could.
No, they will. One more promises have kept. I've asked, had a few people want Kelly to tell the story again, because one of the promises that really wasn't even in the top 10, maybe even the top 20, is the idea of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But if you haven't heard, Chelsea, and I'm sure some of our listeners haven't heard, Kelly and Gary Bauer were talking to him. Can you tell that story again? Because it just, I think, is so delightful.
Yeah, we were at the Value Voters Summit in the green room, because I spoke, I'm trying to remember, I think I spoke right before, at the time, candidate Trump. And he came into the room, and Gary Bauer and I were in there, and he said, I just heard something. He said, is it true that evangelicals are very pro-Israel? And we were like, yes, it is true. And we kind of explained why. And he said, so if I go out and say something very pro-Israel, they'll like that, right? And we said, yes, they will like that. And we watched him go out and say something pro-Israel, and everybody clapped and cheered and screamed. And that showed the level of his understanding at that point. But yet, a few years later, he had changed the embassy. I mean, he had done something that, a lot of presidents promised to do, but would not follow through with.
The 1995 bill provided funds, but candidate and President Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, none of them did it.
Well, my other favorite thing was this, and I thought this was so telling, was the story of how he ended up doing the embassy, which is he said they brought to him on his death, he was signing all these things, and they brought to him this thing to sign that said, you need to sign this. And he looked at it. It was going to be like $1 billion for the embassy. It was going to take 10 years. By the time he was done, it cost $200,000, and it's just perfectly fine and has great security.
It does. It has great security. I've been there. We'll take a break, and we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Lately, politicians on both the left and the right have been criticizing capitalism. Senator Elizabeth Warren calls for accountable capitalism. Senator Marco Rubio proposes what could be called common good capitalism. And Senator Bernie Sanders proposes democratic socialism as an alternative to unfettered capitalism. By the way, they aren't the only ones using the term. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz argues in his book, The Bit of Everything, for a new social contract. He says we need to get rid of the kind of selfish, unfettered capitalism we've had for the last 40 years. Jonah Goldberg, in a recent column, asked the same question I've been asking. What on earth are these people talking about? Decades ago, during the progressive era, presidents did all they could to restrain capitalism. Teddy Roosevelt broke up the trust, and Franklin D. Roosevelt created dozens of government restraints during the New Deal. Jonah Goldberg asked another good question. If you think there are no restraints on the market or on economic activity, why on earth do we have the Department of Labor, HHS, HUD, FDA, EPA, OSHA, and the IRS? Yes, our economy sometimes benefits certain people and organizations more than others. This isn't because of unfettered capitalism. It's due to the fetters government puts on certain sectors of our society to the benefit of others. It's called crony capitalism. Laws and bureaucratic regulations benefit select businesses and industries in agriculture, manufacturing, banking, and a variety of other fields. So if you think the government needs to spend more or regulate more or tax more, then make your case for doing so. But let's stop arguing against the straw man of unfettered capitalism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, in the midst of all this, we're in a campaign, and I want to spend some time looking at a very good article that came out by Dr. Laura Hollis. She is a professor at Notre Dame, and we'll get into that, and Chelsey will give us a little bit of the content there. But she's asking a good question. Why would someone vote for a Democrat for president in light of all the issues we've talked about? And it's a Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and the whole long list. So we'll go through that in just a minute. But I thought real briefly, I'll just mention what happened in the UK, because, Kelly, that's at least a possibility that there are some similarities. The last time you had so many conservatives sitting in chairs there in the House of Commons, Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister, and everybody thought that Boris Johnson was going to get completely eliminated by Jeremy Corbyn, who is the socialist. Well, number one, there were a lot of people who thought that would happen because there was a vote on Brexit, and a lot of people said they wanted to deal with that erroneous vote that took place, and this would be a way to do so. That didn't work. Number two, they honestly thought that nobody would take Boris Johnson seriously, and in terms of what has happened so far, he will be, of course, the prime minister. I heard that Jeremy Corbyn is stepping down, and I don't know if there are any lessons to be learned in America, but it is kind of interesting to see what happened on the other side of the Atlantic.
There's a lot of there's really is a lot of similarity. There's a almost an incredible spiritual overlay of exactly what's going on there. I mean, it's kind of like the Democrats here didn't like the election results, and they've just tried to refuse to accept them for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Which is exactly what's going on in Brexit. And again, I think there's going to be some parallels with this with the presidential vote. I think the polling just like over there, is going to show. It might say it's going to be close.
Yeah, they kept saying it was close, and they said all the Twitter activity shows that the socialists are going to win.
Yeah,
as
very
if Twitter,
reliable.
And it was the largest, loss, like, in however many years, decades, right?
Since 1987.
And I think it's because, again, it's gotten so that if you say to somebody, I like Boris, or in the United States, I like Trump, okay? Somebody's going to maybe key your car, or, so people don't necessarily all feel comfortable answering those questions when they're called by posters.
Of course.
And so I have a feeling there's going to be the same kind of surprise in the United States. But I think ultimately what's behind this is it's not even really conservatism, liberalism. There's some of that. There's this approach to sort of push this really extreme left-wing craziness that is also anti-Semitic and a lot of other things that are very unpalatable. But I think ultimately what's going on here is sort of a populism that says, how dare you, not do what we told you to do. I think that's what caused Trump to get elected the first time. I think they said a pox on both your parties. Nobody does anything. You're all just padding your own yourself, and nobody's getting anything done. We need to throw somebody in there that's enough of a bully that they're going to throw all the tables over and say, stop this. And they did that. And what's happening is the establishment's been sort of resisting that over and over again. I think that's just going to increase the number of that, just like as with Brexit. They made clear what they wanted done, and they've kind of refused to do it. And I see a lot of similar strains in the two of that. In addition to the fact that Boris and Trump both kind of had some similar looks to them, don't they? They kind of look like...
Feels good for those with our funny hairs.
Like, wait, you're not a politician.
Yeah, you don't even look like it. Yeah.
You look like you're coming from a bar in a fight or something.
I just love photos of him next to the Queen. They're my favorite. But, I really did think two things about this. The first is actually my aunt, who is British, what she had to say about it, which she said the liberal elites tried to take away what we voted for. And I think that there's something that really resonates with the human spirit, where we don't like being treated like children. We don't like being told that we made the wrong decision and we're going to make those decisions for you, which is exactly what the Liberal Party in England did. They said, you voted Brexit, you didn't really mean it. And if you had the chance to redo it, you might vote differently. And they spent 3 years undermining their very own people. And there was a big backlash because of that. They said there are fewer liberals in Parliament than there have been in a century today. And that the people really don't like being treated like children. And we as Americans, I think, can relate to that a lot with these socialist ideas that are coming out. And as extreme as the left is being, essentially they're saying to the American people, you're incapable. You're incapable of managing your own finances, your own education, your own insurance, your own medical care. There are so many ways that Democrats are telling the American people, we don't trust you with your own pocketbooks. And I think that's going to fall on deaf ears. And then the second thing I really think that is meaningful for us to understand is that at the end of the day, you have to be active. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier on the show when our caller said, can we sue the government for wasting our taxpayer dollars on this impeachment process? And the answer to that is no. But I think we underestimate how politically active people really are. And if you start asking people on election day, text your friends and say, are you going to the polling booth? Are you registered to vote? Really, we need to be talking about these issues and making sure that our circle of 10, 20, 30 people, our family members, are out being active, because if you sit at home, others will decide for you. And I'm really glad that this week the Britons didn't sit at home.
Here's something I want to put on the table that we've not talked about with either of you two, and that is, Kelly, you just said a minute ago that people are a little bit hesitant to say that they approve of the president. Then what do we make of 3 separate polls, including Rasmussen and Emerson and some of these that we really respect, that say that 3/4 of African-American voters approve of Donald Trump? That would tell me that percentage is probably even higher than that. And if I'm a Democratic candidate, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, Hillary Clinton lost last time with 88% of the African-American vote. What does that mean?
Well, I think if this sort of change begins to occur, it'll decimate the Democratic Party. I mean, if you move the polls 10% in the African American community, there's no way they can win their races. Now, I think this would be incredibly good for African Americans because instead of sort of, well, we know what they're going to do, so we don't really have to deal with their issues. I mean, the parties would actually have to listen,
yes,
and try to do good public policy that meets the needs of any constituency is this way. If you're just sort of locked in, it kind of limits you a little bit. But I do think that's going to happen because I think the most common thing with almost everybody, well, most people, I don't know, what is it, 80%, 90%? If you ask of the people who, if they were really honest to you and they were speaking to a pollster and didn't feel like they were in danger, right? And they said, I like Trump. I like President Trump. 80, 90% of those people would say, I don't like him personally, but I really like what he's doing. And in the African American community, you've never had anybody, I mean, this is the lowest unemployment in the history of our country for African Americans. You got people like Kanye and other very well-known people embracing what the president has been doing. And so there's something very different going on there. And it'll be fascinating to see what happens in the actual vote. Because we haven't seen this before, anything like this, and the polling is showing this. And I think, I thought Kanye's answer was really good when he was asked, kind of, how dare you support Trump? Don't you know he's a racist, right? And he could have answered saying that's a ridiculous charge. You're just listening to the same place over again where they tell you that. But he didn't. What he said instead was he said, you know what? Telling me who I should vote for because of my race, that's racism. And he's exactly right. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit in the African American community in these pollings is, don't tell me what my beliefs are supposed to be based upon the color of my skin. And so I think there's a boldness rising there. And I think it's because, he's actually got results. And that's ultimately what people are going to be looking to is how, is my life better than it was 4 years ago when they come to that election? That's really the issue, right? That's what most people are going to say is, with this president, is my life better than it was 4 years ago, or is it worse? And on the economic side, clearly because the reduced regulations, the tax reductions, everything else, the unemployment figures, for the vast, vast majority of people, they're going to say, yeah, it's much better in those areas.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get some more comments and, of course, take a phone call, but also Dr. Laura Hollis, why would someone vote for a Democrat for president? It's a question that is going to be front and center very soon, especially since some of these caucuses and primaries are going to be unfolding very quickly in 2020. And also, it's going to be a big issue on the next Democratic debate next, I guess it's Thursday, which will be taking place. Of course, we'll talk about that next Friday as well. And we'll take some phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212. Last half hour, we'll have an open line. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Chelsey Youman, as well as Kelly Shackelford, and we're going to talk about their organizations in just a minute. But our fifth article here, why would anyone vote for a Democrat for president? And it's a legitimate question that is being asked by Dr. Laurel Hollis, because she's just going through various issues and policies being presented, which let me come to you, Chelsey, are not doing very well. If you go out and ask, do you think abortion should be till the moment of birth? Most Americans, even pro-choice ones, go, no. Do you think Medicare for all, which would require you to lose your health insurance, is something we should implement? They go, no. And so these are not necessarily winning articles and winning policies and winning laws and procedures. But nevertheless, that seems to be kind of what's right now being pursued by many of the leading candidates for the Democratic Party.
Yep. So, so much of politics, we can talk about it in theoretical terms or, philosophical terms even. But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to hard numbers. I mean, we see history will tell and show what is successful and what wasn't. And I thought she just did an excellent job going through those, saying the Democrat policy proposals would be a fiscal and social disaster. And she talks about how much, when you historically have estimated how much like Medicare would cost, for instance, in 1965, they projected it would cost about $12 billion. But in actuality, by 1990, it cost $90 billion, 9 times almost as much as they projected. And she went on to do that analysis for so many of the social programs or the more liberal leaning programs, just how insanely expensive they are. And then she goes on to talk about how much their policies really would not be for business growth. It would stifle business growth, mandated minimum wages. I mean, their interference in so many of our systems would be highly detrimental to our economy. And all of that does go to show, things like they oppose religious liberty and they change the Constitution at their whim. And I think there's a consistent sentiment among progressives. They're called progressives for a reason, and that is in the DNA of their party, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. So it's just part of their philosophy of their politics is, if part of the system is broken, throw it all away and start all over. And we've seen this with Medicaid. We've seen it with Obamacare. We've seen it with now the presidency through this we talked about earlier, the impeachment process. Is just throw it away and start all over. And the answer is always bigger government, less options for the American people. And at the end of the day, I think that the country, that doesn't really resonate with the country. We can't relate to socialized medicine and socialized higher taxes for education to be paid for free, quote unquote, but you pay 60% or more in taxes. So she had a lot of really good points in this. At the end of the day, I think that voters should just still get out and vote and be excited to vote for a candidate and a policy and not just against some of these other ones.
Some of these people that have actually run Democratic candidates in the past have said, if we're going to win, and they're thinking they want a next Democratic presidential candidate to win, we have to win in the heartland. And they've said that Medicare for all is a great way to actually be defeated. As a matter of fact, one said the other day it's probably the longest suicide note ever written by a presidential candidate. And maybe that's why Elizabeth Warren has gone from, 28% to 10%. But even in the second page here, he talks about opposing religious liberty, abolishing the Second Amendment. That's not going to help you get just lots of votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, is it?
Well, absolutely not. And, I read a book about kind of the differences, because sometimes I have a hard time wrapping my head around what the left is doing or thinking. And some of this does come down to truly, when we say constitutional rights on the right, we're thinking about protections for the people and immutable rights or natural rights that shouldn't move or change or waver with time. But when the left hears constitutional rights, they associate it in the study with white supremacy. And so they go through just this whole list. Religious liberty is the same, but if you say freedom, they think a little bit differently. And so understanding that on the left, there truly are really big differences in our understanding of how the world works and how we frame things.
Yeah, it's
it's a crazy time, but I think really the Democrats don't have anybody at this point who, they're really excited about. I mean, that's why they can't get behind anybody. These are such extreme candidates, most of them. Many of them call themselves socialist, right? I mean, it used to be you'd run from that label, but in this case, you have people embracing it, and which is why Joe Biden, despite being sort of a bumbling kind of says crazy stuff every week, kind of embarrassing things every week, why he's still in the lead, because he might be sort of bumbling and all that, but he hasn't taken all the crazy positions to the extreme. But I think overall, I don't think they're, if you watch what they're saying, they're not satisfied. They don't really like any of their candidates, which is why many people, there's a poll just this last week, I think, that said if they were all, if Hillary Clinton was in, that they would pick her as their favorite, right now over the rest in the bunch. So that tells you something about where they are. They're not satisfied, which is why the impeachment is an attempt to see if they can injure or, slow down Trump, because they're worried that none of the current candidates will be able to beat Trump.
Again, is it possible they just keep splitting it out? Because we got 7 candidates that next week we'll have a chance to hear from, and next Friday we'll talk about that. But, well, of course, you mentioned Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Tom Steyer, and Andrew Yang. And now, let's be honest, some of those last 3 aren't even going to have a chance. Michael Bloomberg has gotten a percentage, don't know, but again, realistically, one of those 7, and more realistically, one of those 4 are the possible nominee. But because they seem to be splitting their votes all over the place, Pete Buttigieg is probably going to win the Iowa caucus. Bernie Sanders probably going to win New Hampshire. Joe Biden probably wins maybe South Carolina, maybe Nevada. Elizabeth Warren wins no of those. Well, we'll see where that goes. Very quickly, you say, we just keep going along. But this was very different than, say, 4 years ago when, much to the chagrin even of some of the people around the table, Donald Trump was doing very well. Yeah. It was Donald Trump and somebody else, and the somebody else very quickly became Ted Cruz, and that was it. But I don't see that happening this time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if it will or not. I mean, generally the process kind of forces that because you run out of money. Yeah. Because it begins to be so expensive that if you're not winning or in the top 2 or 3 in each of those, in Iowa, New Hampshire, and all, usually you're in trouble. So we'll see. But I mean, right now, certainly it looks like you've got just a ton of candidates in this race, and they're going to stay in the race, and especially with Bloomberg jumping in now.
Right, $30 million, and he's rising, so who knows? And he could actually afford to spend a lot of money in Texas and California.
But I don't see him. The problem with him is he doesn't win any of those early primaries.
No.
And so,
I don't know.
Again, Giuliani tried that approach. It didn't work out so well for him in the Republican side. So I really, I think they've got a real problem. I think they know they have a real problem right now with regard to not having any candidates that people can coalesce around and really be excited about.
The other question I have, and I guess this is for the 2 old guys around the table, but Chelsey, you can jump in as well. There have been a few times where you have had Democrats run some pretty radical individuals. 1972, George McGovern. That did not work out well for the Democratic Party. 1984, a little different, but still same kind of thing, where in each case you had the Republican win 49 states. Are we somewhat like that this time? Does it have any of that kind of feel to you?
Well, I mean, I would say if they were just doing what they want to do, yes, that's what we would have. We would end up with Elizabeth Warren or Bernie or somebody like that. I mean, somebody way to the left. I just think that the main goal right now of the Democratic Party is to beat Trump. And so very few, I see a lot of these people, Biden's got this support, but very few of those people are excited about Biden.
Right.
They just feel like these other people probably won't get enough votes, so I'm going to go for Biden, even though he's not my favorite. And so I think normally, yes, they would have picked a McGovern-type person. I don't know if they're going to do that or not. It's so far they haven't. Every time you thought they were moving that way. And what would happen if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren jumped out? Would those votes combine, or would they split?
Yeah, and again, the thought is that maybe Bernie Sanders would step down and then Elizabeth Warren would catch fire, but that really has not happened. So anyway, we're going to take a break. We come back, I want to talk about your two organizations, because I think this issue of abortion, this issue of religious liberty are two issues we've surfaced in the campaign. And sometimes people say, what can we do? But also, I pick up on what you said. I've said that politics is not just about numbers, it's about enthusiasm. Have you seen any of the Trump rallies lately? Does seem to be a lot of enthusiasm, and sometimes getting enthusiasm for a incumbent president running for re-election is hard, but seems like this impeachment thing has provided some of that. But we'll come back and talk about First Liberty and the Human Coalition Action, and if you would like to know about any of those, you can go to their websites. But if you also have a final comment or question, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Psychoanalyst Erica Commissar is a therapist to families and especially children in private practice in New York City. Her periodic columns for the Wall Street Journal on child rearing are treasures. I first noticed the one on why moms should prioritize being home with their babies for their first 3 years. This practical wisdom almost goes without saying. Some of her points might shock or seem retro if they weren't timeless and backed up with stats and tons of experience. Her latest piece concerns the cultural shift surrounding religion, something we Christians lament. Erica Commissar is a practicing Jew. She writes that one of the most important and neglected explanations for the depression and anxiety that is so prevalent among children is declining interest in religion. She cites a 2018 study in the American Journal of Epidemiology in which Harvard researchers looked at 5,000 children or teens who reported that they attended religious services at least once a week. These kids scored higher in psychological well-being and had lower risk of mental illness than their peers who did not attend services. Plus, they were more likely to volunteer, have a sense of mission, to forgive, and were less likely to use drugs or engage in early sexual activity. Ms. Commissar writes, the belief in God, in a protective and guiding figure to rely on when times are tough, is one of the best kinds of support for kids in an increasingly pessimistic world. That's only one reason, from a purely mental health perspective, to pass down a faith tradition. When someone close to a child dies, she writes, belief in heaven helps them grapple with this tremendous and incomprehensible loss. A parent might ask, what if I don't believe? Her shocking counsel? Lie. Much better, explore the claims of Christ. Take your kids to church. Provide them a spiritual center, a buffer, and the natural community of church involvement. For their sake, go and drink deeply. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I thought you would like to hear about these two organizations. We've talked about them before, but I wanted to give them some time. Let me just mention real quickly that those of you who've been listening online have heard Penna Dexter's commentary, which is on Kids Need Church. Very well done. And if you are interested, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on the Viewpoints commentary there and print it out. If you haven't signed up, of course, my commentary today is about unfettered capitalism, which just cracks me up. You're hearing Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, And even in sort of a bizarre sort of way, Marco Rubio saying, oh, well, I think we need more regulation on capitalism, going, really? Since the 1930s, we have so burdened capitalism. So anyway, if you'd like to read either of those commentaries, they're available on our website. And you can, of course, sign up. You'll receive mine Monday through Friday. And then Saturday, you'll receive Penna Dexter's. But, Chelsey, I want to come to you for just a minute. humancoalition.org. We talk about the abortion issue. We've had pregnancy resource centers in this area, but you have local strategies, church outreach, and things of that nature. So talk about what you do, because I really want to encourage people to find out more about what Human Coalition Action is doing. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Human Coalition Action is the brand new governing grassroots arm of an organization that's already existed for 10 years. So Human Coalition has served women. They've served over 30,000 women across the country. They partner with 45 pregnancy resource clinics and own quite a few of those, just serving women and meeting them where they're at, women who have already determined to have an abortion. Our group enters the picture, comes in and says, if we can help stabilize your circumstances, get you on your feet, get you out of domestic violence or whatever the situation may be, would you choose life? And 75% of the time, women say they want to parent. And so it's been an incredible ministry they've done, but they realized that Planned Parenthood has no direct competitor. And functionally speaking, one of the reasons Planned Parenthood is so successful is they're in the government. They're working politics. They're advocating for their issues. And so we at Human Coalition Action are the first functional competitor to Planned Parenthood, where we are going to talking to governing officials, working with grassroots, mobilizing the grassroots. And I'm so excited to be a part of that team. And if you want to hear more about what we're doing, go to hucoaction.org. hucoaction.org and sign up, and we'll help you learn how to get involved in your community, in your church, how to talk to your pastor about these issues, and just really start working towards empowering women, both by serving them, but also by getting the government more engaged.
You know, I just the other day was talking with Joe McElhenney about the other aspect of Planned Parenthood, about the idea of abstinence and those kinds of things, and Lori Kirkendall and some of the others, and they were saying the problem there is, again, they're all very fragmented. They don't talk to each other. And the left does talk to each other. Matter of fact, when I was growing up in Berkeley, and everybody knows I was born in Berkeley, there was a phrase that the liberals that I was around used to use: no enemies on the left. In other words, I don't care if you're an environmentalist, a feminist, whether you're a Marxist, we're all going to work together. On the right, that doesn't happen. You know, as we've talked about before, the conservatives have these circular firing squads, don't they? And so there seems like there's a real need to have somebody getting all of these different pro-life groups talking to each other. Am I true?
Right. Our goal is truly just to serve, and that began by serving women, and now it's extended to what I'm doing, which I'm so excited about, which is serving our governing officials. You would be shocked how many say, if we get more domestic violence halfway houses for women, would that help? How can this help women? Do they need more child care? I mean, really thinking beyond your traditional bills, which we are for, the traditional abortion bans, but extending that to really tangible ways that we know will move the meter. We have such a wealth of information about who these women are because we're already serving them. And our goal is to really just unify that movement. I always say the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And we have so few workers in the pro-life movement. We need to coalesce, come together based on data, and make policy decisions that are really going to end abortion and minimize it.
Oh, that's very good. Human Coalition, we have that link. Also, we have a link to firstliberty.org. And Kelly, we started out by saying that you can go there and click on buttons that say school, military, house of worship, community. Just the other day, I talked about when we were talking about even the whole idea of having a nativity scene and things like that. We've sent people to a piece that you posted last year by Hiram, which apparently when he was telling the story about in his difficult family situation, how having a Christmas celebration at church and in the schools was very helpful, especially in the schools. And so when we stand up for this issue of religious liberty, it's not just for our rights, it's also just the impact that it can have on families, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, this year has been a turning point. I mean, you know, I've been fighting for 30 years for religious freedom, and things I never thought possible are now happening. And part of it's because of what we talked about earlier with the judges. As we get better judges on the bench, we get judges who actually think their job now is to find the original, text and the original meaning. And so what that's doing is it's taking us back to our first principles as a country, to religious freedom as it was meant. And so the Bladensburg Cross decision this year was a big beginning because we got rid of a bad precedent in that, the Lemon case, which has been used to sort of create a hostility to religion our whole lives. And I really believe that if we continue doing what we're doing right now, I really believe this. Every American is about to have more religious freedom than they've ever had in their lifetime. And we're just at the beginning of that sort of curve on the chart.
Right.
And it's only going to get better. I think we're going to build on that over the next 10 years. I think we're going to have incredible gains for our children and grandchildren. And so I just encourage people, you hear a lot of bad news. You hear all this stuff about impeachment. Behind the scenes, some really good stuff is going on with regard to religious freedom. Now, why is God doing this? I don't know. Is he doing it because there's going to be a revival? I don't know. Is he doing it because it's just so hostile that we're going to need this protection? Either way, the point is God is providing it, and we need to take advantage of what he's providing. I mean, are you asking somebody to church? Are you talking to people about the Lord? This is our responsibility. But what a unique time. I mean, don't be discouraged by what you're hearing. There's incredible stuff happening in the religious liberty arena, and I don't know what God is doing ultimately, but I know he's working, and it's a change that I never thought possible in my lifetime. So if people aren't on the First Liberty list, I'd encourage them to go to firstliberty.org and get the email every week. I guess it's every 2 weeks technically. And you can keep up and you can share with others kind of what's going on, because there is some really good stuff going on with regard to religious freedom.
Might just mention, too, that one of the clicking through pieces is on the book Undeniable, Faith on Trial in America. Inside look at the cases, controversies, and unrelenting attacks on religious liberty. So first of all, it talks about the problem, but we talked a lot this year about the solution, and maybe when we get you back in here for our year in review on December 31st. I think you're joining us then. We'll talk about some of that as well. But you both know some of the individuals you've been placing on the federal court and court of appeals. These are really good people that have worked with you before, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people that would be, people who are listening, these are the kinds of people, they're brilliant, but they're the kind of people who would be sitting next to you in your church. And they're filling the courts right now. And they're the youngest age ever appointed in the history of our country. I've got a little chart. When we started, when Trump started, the average age of Democratic appointed lead judges was 66.
Right.
Republican was 71. 3 years later, the average age of Democrat has gone from 66 to 68. The average age of the Republican appointed has gone from 71 to 58, which shows you the dramatic the change in age for the future. And these aren't just Republican Democrats. These are a judicial philosophy type and full of really strong Christian people. We've just never seen this quality of judges, both academically, spiritually, everything. And it's going to make a real difference in the future of our country.
Yes. You're a grandfather now. I've been a grandfather. And to think that our grandchildren are going to be benefiting from some of those judges is pretty amazing. Chelsey, thank you. And Kelly, thank you. We are just out of time. I hope you'll have a great weekend, because we are looking forward to a great series of interviews next week. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend. See you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.